Cambodian Genocide. They killed so many kids that the life expectancy was 18. Historians of Reddit, what's a devastating event that no one talks about? In 1859, solar flares hit the Earth, causing an aurora borealis effect to be seen all over the world. It lasted for several days, during which time it was reportedly bright enough to read by at midnight. Telegraph operators reported receiving shocks and burns from the devices, and in some cases removed the batteries powering the telegraphs, as signals were being disrupted by the geomagnetic storm. After removing the batteries, the telegraph still operated, in some cases better than they had when powered. It wasn't particularly devastating at the time, but it's estimated that if a similar storm were to hit us today, it would cripple the entire planet for potentially decades. The estimated repair cost in the US alone is measured in the trillions. In 2012, a similar storm missed the Earth by 9 days. The Anak Massacre of 2005 in Uzbekistan. It is the largest mass shooting in Asia since Tiananmen Square, with over 1,000 killed and even more wounded. The Uzbek government forcefully silenced reform protests by firing into the crowd and then kicked out 90% of Westerners in the country when the US government and UN tried to investigate. Terrible loss of life that rarely gets remembered because the Uzbek government tried so hard to cover it up. I'm not really a proper historian, but I feel the need to mention the Bronze Age collapse. It's not as though nobody talks about it at all, but considering how catastrophic it was, it doesn't get nearly enough attention. At this time, civilizations were still pretty scarce, but the Eastern Mediterranean was full of them. We can't pinpoint an exact reason, but at some point it all fell apart. The Mycenaeans? Gone. The Hittites? Gone. The Minoans? Gone. The Egyptians? Barely clinging on and having serious problems. There are many things that happened around that time in that general area that could be the culprit: volcanoes, earthquakes, drought, famine, war, and invasions from foreigners that came by boat, that historians have named the Sea People because we have basically no idea where they came from. In reality, it was probably a combination of some or even all of them. This is fairly recent, started in 1998 and ended in 2003, but the Second Congo War. It's the deadliest conflict since World War II, with about 5.4 million deaths, a vast majority of them due to malnutrition and disease. The Taiping Rebellion is one of the most extraordinary events in human history that is virtually unheard of in the West. Perhaps as many as 70 million people died in the conflict. The Taipings were truly revolutionary, as they demanded absolute equality between women and men. When they conquered a city, they would give the inhabitants a choice to join them or die. Those that chose not to join were killed, all of them. The conflict lasted for 21 years, 1850 to 1871, and may be the second deadliest war in human history. Literally no one knows about it. The year 536 marked the beginning of a very bad time period. Basically, several natural disasters and social upheaval devastated multiple societies. It's thought that a volcanic eruption blocked out enough sun to cause crop failures across Europe and as far as China. While this was happening, terrible plagues were also afflicting the Middle East. Economies everywhere fell to ruin and stagnation in the years that followed because several other eruptions later made things worse. Cambodian Genocide. They killed so many kids that the life expectancy was 18. During World War II, the Japanese had invaded the Alaskan island of Atu. On the island was the village of Atu, where the Aleutian tribe had lived for centuries. The only non-natives were the wife, school teacher, and priest husband, who were elderly and beloved by the townspeople. The husband was shot in front of his wife by the Japanese. After that, the Japanese loaded the native population onto ships back to Japan, where they worked in POW camps where many died from disease and execution. The Japanese saw them as lower than solid POW and almost subhuman because they didn't fight back and thus treated them horribly. When the war ended, only a handful of the native population survived, and they went back home only to find their village burned down. They left the island and it now remains uninhabited, basically, driving the Atu tribe to extinction. Years later, the Japanese left a peace monument on the island in honor of the American and Japanese soldiers that died there, but have yet to apologize to the descendants of the Atu tribe they destroyed. The Johnstown Flood of 1889. The deadliest civil engineering disaster on U.S. soil, it killed 2,209 people. After a dam collapsed, it swept up rail cars, passengers, trees, an entire town of 10,000, then swirled it around and ejected the debris downriver into a bridge where it all caught fire. Destruction beyond belief, and also that some rich steel magnates up the mountain didn't maintain the dam they used to keep their fishing reservoir. One thing that doesn't get talked about was more of a phenomenon or major problem than event, and that was how many people died in theater fires due to poor design, combustible materials, few fire exits, and panic. One of the worst was the Iroquois Theater in Chicago, 1903, which is both the deadliest theater fire and the deadliest single-building fire in U.S. history, where patrons died after sparks from an arc light set a curtain on fire. Then a chain reaction started, exacerbated by failures of the things in place that were supposed to combat fire. The theater had been overbooked to compensate for earlier poor sales, causing some to sit blocking the exits. The fire was immediately worsened when performers opened the stage door to get outside, as it turned the fire into a fireball. Many people were held inside by iron gates that had been put in place to prevent people from sneaking in without paying. As people fled, they tumbled downstairs, trampled each other, and got squashed to death. Their unfamiliarity with the building got them stuck in dead ends and up against windows. Many jumped from fire escapes and died, while those behind them were saved, the bodies of the earlier jumpers cushioning their falls. All in all, 602 people died, many were children. The story is a lot more complicated and sordid, with city corruption, etc. The one takeaway is the incident promoted the development and use of the panic bar. Galveston, Texas was once considered to be one of the most important commercial ports in the United States and was referred to by several fantastical names such as the Queen City of the Gulf and the Wall Street of the West. All that changed when it suffered a near-direct hit from a devastating Category 4 hurricane in 1900, the deadliest natural disaster in American history. Pretty much the entire city was destroyed by a storm surge, and anywhere from 8,000 to 12,000 people died. Galveston was rebuilt, but it never truly regained its status. Houston became the state's commercial center in the storm's wake, in addition to other factors. Obligatory, not a historian, but I'm in college studying history. The year of living dangerously in Indonesia in 1965 to 66 saw absolute chaos and still has a marked effect on their society. It is possibly one of the largest mass killings of the last century, and I had heard nothing about it ever, living in the West. It's hard to say how many people actually died, but estimates range from 100,000 to 300,000, and even on up to 500,000 or 1 million dead. Basically, the Communist Party in Indonesia was heavily influenced by Maoism and ethnic Chinese civilians. It was the largest communist party outside of China. President Sukarno, who had helped the country through Japanese occupation and independence from the Dutch, British, had kept the house of cards balanced, but was beginning to be swayed by communist policies. The military, staunchly anti-communist, and largely supported by the US, would be looking to take power. One night, 6 high-ranking members of the military were abducted and killed. The army spread the word that the communists were to blame and initiated mass reprisals. Killings, torture, and imprisonment ran rampant over the islands, and even ethnic Chinese or just suspected communists were taken. Despite working with Sukarno for many years, the US would support his liquidation and the rise of the military. It is unclear how extensive American support to the army was, but it is probable they aided in training and may have even helped compile names of communists to the army. Eventually, a general by the name of Suharto would take power and Sukarno would be placed under house arrest with no power. Today, the massacres and chaos are not really taught in Indonesian schools, and it's clear that many have not come to terms with what happened. However, the mass killings of possibly 1 million or more people should rank up there in devastating events. The paddle steamer PS General Slocum, that caught fire and sank in the East River in 1904. More than 1,000 German Americans died in the accident, and it was considered the NYC's biggest disaster until 9/11. Up until that point, the city had had a thriving German community, but that single event almost completely destroyed an entire Lutheran church congregation, comprised of many of the city's most influential citizens. Maybe not an event no one talks about, as it's been lamented many times, but certainly a tragic date of historic note. The Milan Conference. Back in 1880, a bunch of educators of the deaf all decided to meet in Milan to determine how best to teach deaf people. 164 delegates were in attendance, only one of whom was deaf. At the time, there was a conflict among educators of deaf people about whether an oralism or manualism-based approach was better. Proponents of oralism argued that deaf people would never succeed in society if they could not speak and hold a conversation in the same way a hearing person would. To this end, anyone who attempted to sign would be punished, and deaf people were forced to lip read. At the end of the conference, sign language was banned in all educational institutions, and deaf people were not allowed to teach, for fear that it would encourage the use of sign language. As a result, for roughly 100 years, deaf people were essentially isolated from communication and unable to form communities. To this day, amongst older generations of deaf people, many still have never learned to sign. In addition, deaf culture as a whole was and is profoundly affected by this event, because it essentially stole stories that had been passed down from generation to generation, erasing the history of deaf people and the deaf community. Leprosy colonies of Hawaii. People who were diagnosed with leprosy were forcibly banished to Kalaupapa to live out the rest of their lives. They were dug graves, had to stand in them, while their families and friends basically had a living funeral for them where they had the dirt thrown on them. They were then pronounced dead to the world and no longer part of the community. This continued through 1969, even after Hawaii officially became a state. The 60s scoop. In Canada, from the late 1950s to 1980s, the government removed Indigenous children from their homes and families and placed them up for adoption or in foster care. Most remained in Canada, but some were sent to the US or Western Europe. The majority were placed with white middle-class families. A number of them experienced abuse. This even furthered the loss of their culture. My go-to answer is the burning of the great libraries of Baghdad by the Mongols in 1258. The Muslim empires were responsible for saving the texts of Rome and Greece by translating them into Arabic. They had made discoveries into math and science, and they had writings by great philosophers, and all of those writings were saved in these great libraries. When the Mongols invaded and sacked Baghdad, they burned and destroyed many great libraries. So much in fact that the Euphrates River turned dark blue with the ink of the books. No one knows just how much knowledge we lost, but it is hypothesized that as much as 98% of the texts in these great libraries were destroyed. Considering just how much knowledge we still have, thinking about how all of it is only 2% is insane. We will never truly know how much we lost. The schoolhouse blizzard. Back in like 1800s, it was a decently warm winter day. Then out of nowhere a huge snowstorm hit and a lot of kids walking home from school were caught in it. The snow was so thick it said many folks died 5 feet from their house because they couldn't see where they were going. The sinking of the MV Wilhelm Gustloff in 1945 was the most deadly civilian shipwreck in history. It was a German army ship mostly carrying Polish, Lithuanian and Estonian World War II refugees. It was torpedoed by a Soviet submarine. At least 9,400 people died, some estimates go up to 11,000. It's absolutely criminal that the Titanic gets so much more attention, although it was awful, obviously, when the Gustloff sinking killed nearly 10 times as many people. There's a spectacular historical fiction novel about it by Ruta Sepetys called Salt to the Sea. Highly recommend. If you enjoyed the content, please consider leaving a like and subscribing. It truly helps out. Thank you.